This will be a series of unknown length in which I read through a book that I am writing, one chapter at a time, and after each chapter I will discuss thoughts I had on that chapter, what I need to change, what I liked, etc. My intent here is to share my struggles and also to have an audio version of my draft to refer to. That said, any feedback is still welcome. Disclaimers are as follows. First, this audio has been recorded prior to the reading, and so things may change even relative to this disclaimer. Second, my plan is to edit the audio to make the reading more palatable. This may change with later readings. The discussion following the readings will be freeform and unedited. Third, this is a first draft and a vast amount is wrong within the story. There are very serious continuity errors and several parts will simply not make sense. I should cover these errors in the discussion section. However, if you feel you have caught an error that I haven't mentioned in the discussion section, feel free to mention it. Fourth, I'm not a voice actor. I'll do my best, if only so that characters can be told apart, but I apologize when a voice changes from day to day. And with all of that said, let's begin. The working title of my book, which is just a nonsensical name, is Painting with a Thorny Brush. Let's make a start. Prologue. Cade winced as a twig snapped underfoot in the gloom of early evening. The sound rang out in the chill air, and he froze, holding his breath. When nothing terrible happened, he decided to get a bit of rein on his imagination. Far as he knew, no one had seen one of the Veer in these parts for a few years at least. That said, part of that was likely due to no one being stupid enough to go traipsing through the woods, alone, at night, with only a bow. Cade tried yet again to remind himself that whatever had gotten into the coop and killed half of his granddad's flock was obviously small, likely just a vix. At least that was what he was telling himself. It didn't help much, but he was determined to look after his granddad. Cade remembered only a precious few things about his father, but one of the most important to him were the last words he had ever told Cade. "Look after my da while I'm gone, won't you, lad?" And he had. For 8 years he had. Cade heard a rustle off to his right, and his breath caught in his throat. He slowly lifted his bow from around his shoulders and nocked an arrow. He cautiously stepped up onto a fallen tree and strained his eyes to catch any movement. Nothing. Cade relaxed and lowered his bow, feeling silly. He didn't really know what he was doing. All he knew was that replacing the birds without catching whatever beast had broken in was a waste, both in coin and in time. They'd just be killed again. He was no tracker, though. He had caught sight of something slinking away from the farm as the sun was setting, and so here he was, wandering through the woods at night, staring at marks in the dirt and pretending he had any idea what they meant. Just as Cade decided that he had wasted enough time pretending he was a tracker, he saw a flash of light red fur. It was a vix after all. Cade drew his bow again and slowly stepped down from the log while taking great care not to make a sound. In the dim light, Cade could just make out the vix some 20 paces away. Taking aim, Cade tried to calm himself. An easy shot, he thought, especially on a still target. It was just standing there, ears flicking around. "What are you doing?" Cade thought. Then he heard it, a faint clicking noise. Cocking his head, he tried to work out where it was coming from. Relaxing his draw proved to be a mistake. Just as he did, a shadow, barely 3 paces away, started to shift. Cade's mind worked to resolve the shapes into something understandable. As he did, he thought that he was looking at another vix. A long snout resolved first, followed by small, triangular ears. Red fur grew in patchy clumps, and where it was absent, raw sores took its place. A thin canine body, ending in a whip of a tail completely devoid of hair, came last. The blood in Cade's veins turned to ice as he realized that rather than the lithe sets of fore and hind legs a vix should have, this creature crouched low on 4 sets of legs. Each was longer than its proportions should have allowed, and rather than being below the creature, they each splayed out to the side, like some kind of many-legged insect, each ending in a small talon-tipped hand. A hand that looked remarkably human. Cade's skin crawled, and a true deep panic moved in and took up residence within him. Veer. This thought should have been followed immediately by his inner voice screaming at him to run, but there was nothing. His jaw worked and his arms shook, but all thought had fled into the recesses of his mind and the safety of denial. The Via cocked its head, and its mouth contorted into a snarl. At least it would have been a snarl, if not for the eyes. A wicked intelligence behind those eyes turned it into a sadistic grin. Like the hands, the eyes were unmistakably human. The creature crouched low and rocked back slightly, claws grabbing into the earth, about to pounce. This finally snapped Cade into action. Some deep instinct for self-preservation had finally won the duel with his desire to pretend that this wasn't happening. The Via lurched forward, while at the same time Cade tried to center his bow on the beast, managing to get only half a draw before the Via took a second step and launched itself into the air. Shocked by its speed, Cade loosed the arrow early. The shaft flew true, catching the beast in mid-air, hitting on the left side just below the first set of legs, but the half-draw didn't have the power to put the creature down. The Via let out an ear-splitting wail as it collided with Cade. He barely had time to drop his bow and get his hands up and between them. The force knocked him back, and 8 hands wrapped around his shoulders, neck, waist, and head. Cade stumbled and landed hard on the flat of his back. The air rushed from his body, and he groaned, a weak, panicked noise, barely a whimper. 8 limbs pulled Cade in, while the Via tried to work its jaws past Cade's hands, to snap at his throat. Cade tried to reach down to his waist and draw the small hunting knife he was carrying, but every time he took his hands away from the creature, it managed to pull itself that little bit closer to his throat. It was small, but Cade simply couldn't hold it back when it was 8 arms to 1. Cade screamed as the claws of the Via's 4 sets of limbs pushed in further. They were short, but they were many, and they were sharp. The creature, however, was, after the initial hit of the arrow, totally silent. Hate-filled eyes leered into Cade's own as the creature snapped forward again. Then it screamed. Cade realized that as he was reaching for his knife, he had bumped the arrow, still embedded in the creature's side. Cade groped for the arrow, his head turned to avoid the beast's teeth, making it hard to see. Finally, though, his hand gripped the arrow, and with as much force as he could manage, he drove the arrow in as deep as he could. The Via screamed, louder than before, and blessedly the claws tangled all over Cade's body loosened their grip, as the Via pulled away slightly. Cade dropped the shaft of the arrow and pulled his hand away from the Via, using both to undo the catch holding his small dagger and draw the blade. The creature, no longer being held back, and seeing the blade, stopped screaming and dove again for Cade's throat. Cade swung as hard as he could. He felt teeth break the skin on his neck, as his dagger found a home in the creature's side. The jaws pressed deeper, and Cade called out as he gave the knife a violent twist. The agony being inflicted on his neck abated, and the Via fell still. Cade slowly removed himself from the tangle of limbs that he found himself in. It took a short while, and left him with several small cuts where the Via's claws had embedded themselves all down his back. Once free, Cade collected his bow and sought out the corpse of the Vix. Pained as he was, the pelt of a Vix was worth coin, and coin was something Cade needed if he was going to look after his grandeur. As he reached the small creature, he knelt down and hefted it to his shoulders, sparing a quick thought for how stupid he had been. Cade then started a long, trudging, sore walk home. Okay, so this is a prologue, and being a prologue, there's a lot that I really like about it, and there's a lot that I very much don't. This is also more or less the first ever writing I've ever done, really, in a sort of creative story sense. So, I'm somewhere in the area of 10 chapters into the book, and, I'm starting to get a little bit better at, well, debatably getting better at, how I put things and the way conversation flows and how actions are carried out and how I describe things as the chapter progresses, things like that. So there's a lot in here that I think isn't very good with regards to a description is something that I still suck at all the way through. That's something I haven't gotten better yet and something that I'm going to have to work on. And I think it's going to be very important because this book is set in a fantasy setting in another world. And so there's not going to be a lot. I feel that I can just rely on the reader knowing, and I mean, really, if you're going to write a book, even if it was a metropolitan setting, I suppose you'd still want to be describing what's happening in a interesting way. But moving on, there are some bits and pieces in here that I'm not sure about. Namely, the creature that he's looking for is called a Vix, V-I-X. This is shorthand for fox, like a vixen. And I'm wondering if in the story I'd like to have... Do I want creatures that humans would recognize, readers would recognize as animals, or do I want to have every creature, as in all of them, like birds, cows, horses, wolves, all of them be replaced with something made up? There are plenty of books that do this. It's a lot more work, and you have to put a lot more thought into sort of the anatomy of creatures and the biology of creatures and how they would have evolved in this world if they're going to make sense. Something else I could do would be to have all normal creatures but call them something vaguely different, like a Vix. Being that the Vir are, as this book will progress, you'll realize that Vir are, let's say, criminals encapsulated in a fleshy prison that is made as a conglomerate of animals. It may be beneficial to have animals that people would recognize, just so that, someone could say, oh, this human soul has been trapped inside the body of a fox mixed with the, head of a bear or something that people can then picture. Whereas if these animals are completely foreign, I feel like it may reduce people's ability to actually understand what this sort of creature is. The character's name is Cade. I'm happy with that. That's gone through some revisions. C-A-E-D. I kind of like Cade. It's apparently Welsh for have or something like that, which obviously isn't the most exciting word in Welsh, but part of the problem of the story is that he has something he doesn't want to have. And so when I happened across this name, I thought it seemed sort of fitting, and it just sort of worked out that I liked how it was spelt. And lastly, as it's a prologue, I felt... I've sort of heard... This is obviously going to show that I'm not a writer at all, but I have heard that the reason a lot of fantasies have prologues is because very early in the book you want to set sort of readers' expectations for what they're going into. And obviously, if you just start the book at chapter 1 and there's some kid growing up on a farm and absolutely nothing exciting is happening, you're not really setting their expectations for what's coming, which hopefully in this book is going to be, quite a dark, sort of, not cynical, but, very twisted creatures and very not pleasant situations with hopefully a tinge of optimism rounding it out. But because of that, I thought that him going into the woods and encountering some sort of creature that is skin crawling and, disturbing would be beneficial. This does, however, have the problem of, within the history of the world, it's established that most people live in walled cities. So the world is so sort of overrun by Vir. That's V-I-I-R. Just to clear up that confusion, if there was any. The world's sort of overrun by them because in the world's history, in the world's past, rather than acknowledging that people can do abhorrent things, because that sort of is in some ways hard to acknowledge that people can be monstrous. In this world's history, I suppose you'd call it a religion or the religious organization, decided that they would use powers that they had that allowed them to control energy to shift where a soul was placed. And so if a criminal had, committed some heinous crime, rather than acknowledging that a human is monstrous, they decided that it is
better or easier to create a monster. Let me rephrase. They decided that that soul was misplaced in a human body through some sort of cosmic error. That's not really what humans are. Humans are beautiful, good things. And so for this thing to do something horrible, it must be a misplaced soul. It's in the wrong body. And so to correct that, they felt that they needed to create a body that is suitably horrific to house that soul. And so they did this. They, meshed, made monsters and put the souls in those bodies so that their world image is as horrific as it is to have that creature there. You can at least then say that horror is why, that quote unquote person did what they did, is because they're actually that disgusting thing, not like us, not good, pure, decent people. Now, because the world is overrun with these things, and being outside is a problem, it's causing problems both in the prologue and in the early chapters as to why does Cade and his grandfather Emin live outside of a walled city, and currently the theory is that they live in like a place where there's just less Vir. Like, it's not particularly populated, so the Vir don't hang around and etc. And it's been worked into the story somewhat, so that's good. That his encounter with it can be treated as an oddity, which both lampshades it to a degree, and it is also a motive. The fact that there was a Vir there is a motive force for him taking a particular action that he does in future, which is good. I like that it all interplays. But yeah, it does have the problem of me then needing to explain why this area is, not overrun by Vir, and why he would ever leave if this area is safe, because that's part of the reason that he leaves his home later, is that it isn't safe to be here. But this is something that may be discussed more in the chapter 1 discussion. This discussion that I've just had will probably be longer than most of the others, just because it involved some setting of the world. But hopefully the others are just as long, because I do actually want to make these. This is something I'm hoping to refer back to later, and after having laid out all my problems in a bit more of a clear way, I might be able to then move past them and come up with something better. So we will see. But that is it. Thank you for listening if you're still here, and we'll call it there. Cheers.